Hello everybody, welcome back to Forza Horizon 5 with the final iteration of Baja Builds. This track has been fantastic, but every good thing must come to an end. And for a bit of a send-off, I figured instead of building a new car and seeing how it doesn't beat the Maserati, because let's be honest, that thing has led since I think episode 6, around there. It had the perfect combination of grip, power, and incredible lightweightness. That's a word. It was the perfect package. It had everything. It wasn't the best at anything, but it was so good at everything that it was simply unstoppable. It took 18 car builds to get anywhere close to it. And even then, the Miura still couldn't beat it. It was close, but it wasn't enough. So instead, I'm going to be revisiting some older builds, redoing them, rerunning them with the experience that I have, and seeing how much faster they go. And we start out with, well, our baseline vehicle, the Ford Bronco R Welcome Pack. So technically this isn't really a build, it's just a rerun. Now, this is the same thing, we're only going to show the fastest laps, in this case, fastest stages, because I did do the full 3 runs for each vehicle, so I guess 15 runs total. This did take quite a while. Normally these things I knock them out recording, editing, and uploading within 2 or 3 hours if I'm good enough, if I'm fast enough. This did not take that long. But it was good fun, it was very interesting, and the Bronco R is a very capable vehicle. It's got massive off-road tires, 800 horsepower. It does have 2 downsides though. 1, it is ridiculously heavy. I think apart from the Taycan, it is the heaviest vehicle here. And even then, it might actually be heavier than the all-electric Taycan. So, well, sure, it has 800 horsepower, it's the size, and it has the aerodynamics of a barn. It has no aerodynamics, in fact. Now, that worked for the Sierra, and that worked for the Maserati, but this is nowhere near as light, and this is nowhere near as agile as the Maserati. For what it is, the size that it is incredibly agile and incredibly fast, but that is all relative speaking, which is why in the original time it did a 2:32.239, and driving this thing again with the experience, it felt very easy. The massive tires really helped out. It had no loss of traction, it had virtually no understeer. It was exactly what I wanted to drive. It was a perfectly neutral vehicle. Which is weird to say about a massive truck, but it's true. It was fantastic to drive. It just didn't have the outright acceleration or the outright handling that these vehicles really need if you want to get into the top tier. But all in all, I am very pleased. It's probably one of my favorite vehicles to drive, honestly, the Welcome Pack version, because the normal one is, I think is in C class, it's pretty slow, but the Welcome Pack is incredibly fast. Anyway, we only have a few more corners to go. You can see the acceleration, not quite as much as other vehicles here. I think it's on par with the Ford Escort, ironically, but it's much better at the jump, carries good speed, and we are across the line. Our next vehicle is one that I thought was very underwhelming, the Forsberg Racing Datsun 280Z. This was a drift car that I built into A class. It started out as S1 class, but putting the all-wheel drive and the route suspension and the off-road racing tires drops it down in A class, very similar to the Porsche Taycan. And this thing, it was, I think, the second car I ever ran, and it was sort of terrible. I'm gonna lie, it's sort of awful. Up until the BMW Isetta, it was the worst vehicle that we had. And bear in mind, the Isetta was literally the last car that we ran, so it was last for the entire series. But driving it again, it has a lot of characteristics that I like. It's got a pretty lightweight nature. I think it's like 2,500 pounds roughly, with all-wheel drive, so it's pretty light, not the lightest, not exactly Daytona or Maserati light, but it's alright. It's decently powerful, just over 380 horsepower. And it's got decent sized tires. It's a pretty middle of the road build. And we've seen vehicles with those middle of the road builds do pretty darn well. but they've never done exceptionally well, to be honest. They're always middle-of-the-road builds where they have decent power, decent handling, and it usually ends up rather fittingly in the middle of the road. But with this thing, and this experience that I had, I was almost certain that we could improve the actual speed of it. Because it always felt weird in just doing a 234.3, when, again, as I mentioned in the original video about this vehicle, it is actually slower than a Renault that fell over during its run. We'll get to that car in just a second, but the Forsberg Racing rerun, again, very nice to drive. It's not exceptionally fast. It's decent 106 heading up to the jump, and it's got a decent amount of turn-in. I could use with perhaps a little more high-speed turn-in. It doesn't have the tire size to really deal with the high-speed corners on the sand dunes. But apart from that, and maybe a little more power, we can't do that because of the PI, obviously. But apart from those two things, those are the only things that actually changed. All in all, a pretty B- car, I would say. Not great, not terrible. Missed the jump because I can't have one of these videos without missing the jump at least once. Probably the worst thing I ever put into a build, but anyway, it is across the line. Speaking of Renaults, the Renault 4L was the second worst vehicle until the Untitled rolled around. It was also the first vehicle we ever built because it was a barn find car and I wanted to mess about with it. And yes, as you saw with that first corner, it is very prone to falling over. I was surprised by how prone this was. I knew it wasn't going to be great because it's very tall riding, relatively speaking, and it's pretty narrow. But the fact that it fell over literally every single run without fail on that video, the original video, was kind of amazing, to be honest, and very unexpected. It still got a half-decent time because the one that it did fall over on, it actually fell over perfectly along the racing line and landed on his wheels, Colin McRae style at the X Games. But it's still not ideal if your car rolls over in the middle of a run. And I knew this thing, again, would actually have some pretty good chance of being good. Because it's very lightweight. It's very much like the S-Sport. It's very light, one of the lightest cars I've ever run. And it's all-wheel drive, as stated in the rules. It's got decent tires because it does have a wide body kit, strangely enough. And it gets extra downforce because of the mighty tire on the roof. Obviously. And it's got a turbo rally engine making almost, I think it's making almost, if not over, 400 horsepower. So again, I actually did not change anything to this build. It's the exact same build that I ran last time. Didn't even do a tune, really. A tune change, so it's exactly as it was on the very first episode, which is rather fitting, you know, full circle sort of thing. And my only objective was to not fall over. And I fell over 2 times. However, on the third run, I did not fall over. You saw the rear wheel cocking up a little bit, but I did actually manage to keep the thing on all 3 wheels. Most of the time anyway. Had a few hair-raising moments, but all in all, it stayed on the ground, didn't fall over, and that means with the experience that I've gotten, it should be a significantly faster time. And if you're paying attention to the top left corner, you know that it was a significantly faster time. We'll figure out how fast it was relative to previous at the end, but it's across the line. Now, I didn't want to limit this episode to just reruns. All 3 vehicles I've done so far haven't really been rebuilt. I mean, I rebuilt the Forsberg simply because I had reverted it back to stock, but as a whole, all of these vehicles have just been reruns of existing builds that had, well, very early on in the series, so they didn't have very much experience. But these last 2 vehicles, I wanted to actually do proper rebuilds, so I focused on the more experimental builds I did out of my own curiosity's sake. So, for instance, the Arctic truck here should have been pretty darn good. It has massive tires, full Forza aero, and already fantastic suspension. However, it had the LFA V10 in it because I wanted a V10 pickup truck. So yes, it's a great, sounding engine. I love the engine. For a build series, it's sort of terrible because, well, it has no torque. And you don't need torque if your vehicle is as light as the Escort or the Sierra, but when you're in a massive pickup truck, you need as much torque as you can to accelerate as quickly as you can, and well, this didn't have that. It was horrifically slow accelerating. It's one of the slowest vehicles I've ever driven in this series, which includes a BMW I setup, for crying out loud. It wasn't as bad as the Forsberg or the Renault, but it wasn't quick. It did a 2:31.4, so it did beat the Bronco, but it was not exactly high up the leaderboard. But this one here has a more sensible 6.2 liter V8. So it's got more torque, similar amount of horsepower, but it's that torque that makes all the difference. That makes all of the difference because it is so much faster accelerating. No, it's not like the Defender, which was insane because it had 1,000 horsepower, but it is quick. It's significantly quicker than it was, and in the vehicle it actually has pretty decent grip. I mentioned it earlier in that video itself that I really like how this thing drives. It's a great handling truck, but it doesn't have the acceleration. With this V8 engine, though, it does have the acceleration. No, not as much as other vehicles. I'm never expecting it to win, but it improved a significant amount, and that's my main objective for this rerun, and that's why it's across the line now. Well, we do have one final build, and that is the 1999 Dodge Viper Acr, because this is one of the weird cars that can actually have a diesel engine swap, and when I could swap a diesel engine into a Viper, I was going to do that. Now, this is the exact opposite problem of the V10 Hilux. This has literally over 1,200 foot-pounds of torque, but it makes no horsepower, and it's a very lazy engine. It can't rev very high, so it can't accelerate very quickly. So while sure, it's an ACR Viper, and it can handle great, and it has massive tires, and full Forza aero, just like the Arctic truck, but it has the same problem. It doesn't have any acceleration, at least it didn't when I built it with the diesel engine, but with the stock Viper V10, strangely, if you will believe it, it's very good. Exceptionally good. It had the proper supercar handling that you know and love from the Viper, but it matched it with supercar acceleration. That is what this vehicle was missing. Just like the Arctic truck, they are the opposite sides of the same coin. One of them didn't have enough torque, and one of them had too much torque with no RPMs. They're polar opposites of each other while still being the exact same at the end of the day. It's weird how these two vehicles mirrored each other in such similar ways, and yet built so different when it regards to philosophies. And this was actually better than the Hilux. I love how the Hilux drives, but this thing drives even better. The grip is superb. The turn-in is instant. There's no oversteer. There's no understeer. Even with the all-wheel drive conversion, it's incredibly good to handle. I love this thing. I should have built it from stock, but I built the diesel version out of sheer interest. I wanted to run a diesel now that there was an engine swap for a diesel. And I thought, the Viper's a pretty weird vehicle to have a diesel, let's use that. And I did a disservice to it, because this thing is amazing. You saw I carried 100 miles an hour through that penultimate corner. 100 miles an hour is a ridiculous amount of speed through that penultimate corner. And it actually handled the bumps and the jumps really well, as you can tell, and we went across the line. Okay, I've been around the bush long enough. How good were these cars? So let's start out with the Bronco, because that was our baseline. And it is the slowest of the day, doing a 2:29.1. Bear in mind, it did a 2:32.2 on its initial run, so it already improved by 3 seconds. I have done nothing to the tuning, I've done nothing to the build itself. It is exactly as it was on episode 1. That 3-second advantage is purely based on the experience that I've gotten over the course of this series. And not too far up the road is the V8 Arctic truck Hilux. doing a 2:28 dead. Again, it did a 2:31.4, so the times for these two trucks are very impressive. The V8 Hilux actually beats the Escort, and it's not that far off. It's only a tenth and a bit seconds off of the Sierra, which are the two lightest vehicles that we have run. So the experience and the builds clearly work. 3-second gains are nothing to slouch at, but we are about to see those gains be shattered when compared to the Renault and the Forsberg Racing 280, because those were at the bottom of the table, literally only beating the Isetta, which was, well, basically a three-wheeler with a turbo rally engine shoved into it. Remember, the Forsberg Racing did a 2:34.3. It was the slowest vehicle he had for 18 weeks. And yet, it improved its time by 7 seconds. From a 2:34.3 to a 2:27.7. It's faster than the X-Class. It's only half a second off the Shelby Daytona. It's the second most time we've ever gained in this series, from previous run to current fastest run. That's an insane amount of time, 7 seconds. And yet, it's a tie, actually, because the Renault also improved by 7 seconds, so we had 2:27.3. It's half a second faster than the Forsberg. It's a few tenths off the Daytona. It's an incredible time. Also ironic, because these two vehicles were neck and neck with each other at the very bottom of the table. And now they're neck and neck with each other for 5th place. That is amazing. I knew the Renault had more pace. I said it in the original video, but I couldn't get a clean run. I finally got that clean run, and again, with the experience, because remember, the Renault was not rebuilt at all. It still was using the original A-Class tune that I had on it from that build. And 7-second gain, that's I can't get over how fast that is. It's amazing. Despite all the issues with falling over, the Renault might actually win this championship for me. I know the Maserati was incredible, but yeah, the little Renault, it did alright. But if you want more than alright, we have to talk about the Viper Acr, because it wins this video. It doesn't win overall, it only mustered 3rd, but it beat the Daytona. It did a 2:26.8. It's only the 3rd car to ever break into the 2:26s. It's 4 seconds, almost exactly, faster than its original run. 4 seconds just by using the stock engine. That 4 seconds, I would argue 3 of them, was purely based off the engine and the acceleration. Just like how the Arctic Truck Hilux gained 3 seconds by swapping from a V10 to a V8. The Viper, again, because they're two opposite sides of the same coin, swapped from a V8 to a V10, and it eviscerated everything. It was so good to drive. It was so good to drive. I still would actually prefer the Miura when it comes to pure handling. I would still prefer the Maserati in terms of fun to drive. I think that's a very challenging car, but not too challenging. But the Viper Acr, it lives up to the name American Club Racer. It was very, very good. Still, though, it is 4/10 of a second off that Maserati, which will be the overall winner for this series. Now, I'm not going to be doing like I did in Horizon 4. I'm not going to be using the previous series as a benchmark. I'm going to try and make these series as varied as possible. So I'm not going to carry the previous winner over. I might use it again at some later date, but that's unlikely at this moment. I have no plans for it, at least in terms of build series. Instead, we have a new car with a new track as our benchmark. An entirely new sport. We're going from Baja racing to Rallycross, but you'll have to see that next week. Anyway, that'll be it for this episode of Forza Horizon 5. I'll be back with more